Hello, my name is Caroline Wheeler, and I'm here to discuss communication apprehension, which is potentially something that thousands of people within the United States experience in different ways. As a student of journalism and specifically strategic communication, and someone who has experienced communication apprehension myself, I've recently been researching ways that this presents itself in our lives. But most importantly, I've learned ways in which people are able to overcome communication apprehension, and this is based on specific research-based methods and tactics that are able to help many. With that being said, I would like to begin my presentation on communication apprehension and best practices. Who experiences communication apprehension? Well, according to James McCroskey publications, 10 to 20% of American population suffers from extreme communication apprehension. And then on top of that, an additional 20% experience moderately high communication apprehension. What is communication apprehension? According to Professor Benson, it's defined as an individual's fear or anxiety associated with real or anticipated communication with others. This is a widely known and used definition that can be found in many scholarly articles as well. So I'll begin my presentation with an overview of communication apprehension, including the history, how the term was derived, and what it means today. Then I'll move into the types of communication apprehension. Lastly, I'll go over symptoms and how to cope. This will include tips and best practices on how to help communication apprehension before a presentation. So to begin with history, who is the first person to define the term communication apprehension? James C. McCroskey. Together, McCroskey and his students at Michigan State published the first article in 1970, which defined communication apprehension as a psychological response to evolution. This stems off of a fight or flight response and becomes a physical reaction when our body responds to the threat that the mind perceives. Our bodies cannot distinguish between psychological threats and physical threats, which is what leads to the fight or flight response. He also determined that communication can be split into trait or state forms. Trait being fear, anxiety across the entire communication spectrum, and state being just one situation or context is when an individual experiences this anxiety. It's also entirely possible for individuals to have low trait communication apprehension, but have high state communication apprehension, or vice versa. For example, someone may have fear or anxiety about communicating with a physician during a medical consult, which would be high state communication anxiety, but not have any other fear or anxiety surrounding other interpersonal communications. And it's important to note that research into communication anxiety has typically been focused on finding ways to reduce it among individuals, as it has usually been framed as a negative attribute that people want to limit. There are 3 types of communication apprehension, and I'll cover each one individually. Context-based, situation-based, and audience-based. Context-based is defined as general types of communication settings that evoke anxiety in the communicator. This is according to Professor Benson at the University of Kansas. There are 3 main factors that go into defining this, and this can be promoted by specific communication contexts. And all 3 of these factors, individually or together, can heighten this form of communication apprehension. So formality, uncertainty, and novelty. To speak to formality first, when this increases, it can be seen as the stakes are being raised and prompt more apprehension. An example of this could be a meeting or a small gathering. Someone is completely comfortable to speak there, but then when they're faced with a more formal and public speaking setting, then they experience communication apprehension. They may become intimidated or nervous by the change in amount of people. Another example of formality could be a courtroom or a press conference, and in which case this can make even the most confident speakers and individuals nervous. An example of uncertainty could be the first day of class. not knowing what the professor expects, not knowing where the class is, all factors of that go into uncertainty could create communication apprehension in this form. The third factor is novelty, which presents itself in high tension communication settings, according to Press Rebus. The next type of communication apprehension I'll cover is situation-based. And according to Professor Benson, this happens when a specific set of circumstances causes an average person to become uneasy about communication in settings where they would otherwise be relaxed. This specific type of communication apprehension, according to McCroskey, is created by a unique combination of influences by the audience, time, and context. It can be broken down into influences and dimensions. Influences include audience, time, context. Dimensions include physical, temporal, social, psychological, and cultural. For example, an individual might be okay to talk to their parents until they crash their car. The situation changes, and then they experience communication apprehension with their parents. Another example that I would like to give is a personal example. I experienced this specific type of communication anxiety when I went into the School of Journalism advising office. I talked to the advisors many times before and never experienced any type of communication apprehension. Then the situation changed, the context changed, and I experienced communication apprehension because I was then there for an interview, not so much as a student. And I was interviewing for a job at the front desk and was nervous to talk with them. So this nervousness manifested itself through shaking hands, stumbling over words, forgetting what I was going to say, taking extra time to come up with my answers. And so now I'm able to reflect on that and see how this communication apprehension affected me in this situation, and I'm able to adapt and recognize that for future and current interviews. The third category of communication apprehension is audience-based, where, according to Professor Benson, certain categories of people stimulate an anxiety response. So this specific type of communication describes apprehension promoted by specific audience characteristics. Some of these include similarity, subordinate status, audience sizes, and familiarity. For example, an individual could have no problem talking to an audience of peers of students in a government meeting, but if parents or faculty were to show up, they could become less composed, in which case they would experience audience-based communication apprehension. The degree of perceived similarity between the speaker and the audience is what influences the level of speech anxiety in this context. We all prefer an audience that we feel shares our values over one that does not. So the more dissimilar we feel to the audience. Another example of this could be talking in front of your boss or a teacher, and the size of the audience does play a role. Familiarity is one of the biggest factors with this type of communication apprehension. Some people prefer to talk to strangers, and some people prefer to talk to friends and family. It just depends on how that individual perceives situations. Now I'm going to discuss physical symptoms of communication apprehension, and this section will also include tips on how to deal with them and how to manage communication apprehension. So 3 of the main communication apprehension symptoms that I myself experience are increased heart rate, the feeling of butterflies in your stomach, and shaking, whether that's shaking voice, shaking hands. And it's important to note that there are 2 main components of communication apprehension, physical and intellectual. The mind perceives the threat, and then this manifests itself through the feeling of nervousness, oftentimes, and that's what creates the physical symptoms. Other physical symptoms that people experience include breaking out in a sweat, feeling nauseous, pacing, increased breathing, feeling dizzy or lightheaded. This often happens as a primary reaction of the central nervous system and an intellectual interpretation of these psychological responses, according to McCroskey. And it's important to note that even experienced speakers and performers experience some degree of communication apprehension. What differs is the way that they frame them in their head. Effective speakers have often learned to channel this type of communication apprehension into being something positive and learning to acknowledge it and work with it. Myths about communication and how to be a more effective communicator, including ways in which you should deal with it. But these three are not proven to help and often can have the opposite effect. Beginning on the top left corner, imagine the audience is naked. This is not an effective method because it usually does not calm the presenter's nerves. This is because the audience is not an abstract thing, it's a very real and tangible thing. And to imagine them is to misdirect your focus, which often creates an increased sense of nervousness. Oftentimes, what we imagine is more threatening than the reality that we actually face, which is why this is not an effective technique. Telling a joke is always a good way to begin a speech. This also is a myth and is not an effective tactic to help communication apprehension. This is because humor is some of the toughest material to deliver, especially for novice and beginner presenters. It requires a really good sense of who your audience is, and it's also extremely easy to offend an audience if you don't have the right material prepared or have done the right research on who your audience is. Humor is just too unpredictable and difficult for many beginner speakers and presenters to deliver, especially if the joke doesn't go over well. That dead silence can also increase a sense of nervousness in many people. Now, the last myth I'm going to cover is when people say to write out your speech word for word, that way you can't forget anything. This is not a good technique because if the presenter does forget part of it, they'll have to restart from the beginning to remember their place. If it's memorized, it's very difficult to start in the middle or start from a different place from the beginning. And so you'll have to run through the entire speech in your head again if you choose to use this method and end up forgetting something. This is likely to make your communication apprehension worse as you have the added pressure of knowing that it's memorized. Next, I'm going to cover how to reduce communication apprehension and ways in which you can be successful with this. To begin this part of the presentation, there are some important considerations that you should take into note, and these are speech-related considerations. Usually, communication apprehension declines throughout the entirety of the presentation. It can be broken down into the 4 stages of delivery. Anticipation is the very first minute prior to beginning the speech. Confrontation is the first minute of the speech in which you're actually beginning. Adaptation is the last minute of the speech, and release is after the speech is over and you're no longer engaging in that form of communication. We're oftentimes more likely to be the most anxious right before we get up to speak, and so this is important to note because if you're aware of these stages, you can mentally prepare for it and realize that your communication apprehension will be worse right before the beginning, and this might possibly give you something to look forward to as you continue on your speech. You'll become more relaxed. Knowing these stages can also help you plan accordingly and appropriately in ways to help you manage your communication apprehension. Thinking positively by using cognitive restructuring is often shown to help individuals. Next, you can limit uncertainty by getting a feel for who the audience is before the presentation. You can also adapt your language to the oral mode. You should prepare your speech and adjust it accordingly, like I mentioned, by noting the 4 stages of communication apprehension and the ways in which those present themselves during a presentation. Lastly, watch what you eat. So the butterflies in your stomach are more likely to present themselves if you skip meals before presenting. But then again, if you tend to shake, avoid caffeine. So to conclude, remember that this is a problem that many people face and experience. You're not the only one that deals with this if it is something you struggle with. Overall, I've talked about what communication apprehension is, given an overview of the brief history that it has and research behind it, the 3 types of communications that are defined, and symptoms and how to cope. As this concludes my presentation, if you have time, I would really like to hear from you. If you could please send me an email at the email listed below, ccwheeler@ymail.com. If you could say what was most valuable, most relevant, or any questions or clarification, I would really like to be able to answer those for you. Also, please let me know what piece of information was most applicable to yourself, whether that's something, a tip that helped you, something that resonated with you, or a way in which you experienced this in your life. Your feedback is greatly appreciated, and when you email me, please indicate whether it's a question or clarification or an answer to one of the questions I've posed above. Thank you for your time, and I hope this was helpful.